Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us for this special Leading and Learning event. I'm Javier Soto, CEO of the Denver Foundation. I'm delighted that you've made time to be here with us today. Leading and Learning is an event series that brings together donors and speakers to learn more about a topic. This event is particularly important to our work because we are talking about racial equity and philanthropy. Racial equity, as many of you know, guides all of our work here at the Denver Foundation and is core to our strategic framework. It guides our grant making, our investments, and we know it is an important component to supporting our community. We have some great speakers lined up today. So to kick us off, I'd like to turn it over now to our Chief Impact Officer, Dace West. Dace?
Thanks, Javier. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're so happy to see you with us for this last Leading and Learning event of this year. We hope that this will be as much fun as the others that we've hosted over the course of 2022. So just a few logistics that you're used to hearing. The session will be recorded. You'll be muted for the presentation, but please do submit your questions via the Q&A feature. We'll have a little bit of time at the end of the presentations for your questions, and we'll get to as many of them as we're able during the allotted time. To ensure everyone can fully engage in this event, I have a communications support announcement. Closed captions are available for this event, and you can turn them on by clicking the CC icon at the bottom of your screen. So today we're going to speak with a set of leaders that are doing some really important work in the space of racial equity and philanthropy. We're going to start with our friends from the Vancouver Foundation. And I got introduced to them maybe last year. They were doing some really important work that was really scanning North America for best practices in racial equity work in community foundations. And so they're going to talk a little bit about that and how they're putting it into practice in their own foundation, so we can see what someone else is up to. And then we'll have two speakers from the Denver Foundation who will talk about the work that we're doing internally, and then offer some tips and ideas for ways that you might apply this in your own grant making. So we should have a great time today. And then we'll have a little time at the end for questions. So I'm going to bring up our first two speakers, Elizabeth Geller, who is the co-vice president of grants and community initiatives at the Vancouver Foundation, and Vince Tom, who's the manager of grants and community initiatives at the Vancouver Foundation. And I'll see you all in a little bit. Please enjoy.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Dace, and thank you to everyone for joining us. I think we'll start with the introductions, which I think is the next slide. And I have you down first, Vince.
Amazing. Hello, everyone. My name is Vincent Tom. I am queer. I am a person of color. I have of Chinese descent, and I am the manager of grants and community initiatives at the Vancouver Foundation. And I share these identities because today we are talking about racial equity, and I want to humanize that concept. I want to share with you these topics that there are people behind them. And so I want to share my identities that way, just to show that there are faces to this work. They are not just floating concepts for us. So I'm excited to be talking today. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Vince. And I'll introduce myself. My name is Elizabeth Geller. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm joining you from the unceded and stolen territory of the Hamilkameen speaking peoples, that say out and Sakem people. Just off the west coast of British Columbia in Canada. So waving to you from north and west. And I'm a fourth generation Canadian, settler Canadian of European ancestry. My family, both sides of my family came to Canada in the 1880s from Europe. And again, I start with that so to position myself as well. And position the land and territory that I live on. If you could go to the next slide, thanks so much. I thought it would be helpful to just provide, and I'll go over this quickly, but a bit of context in terms of both British Columbia and Canada. We share a lot of the same history with the US, and we have some specific differences, I think, that are relevant in this context. So like the US, we have a history of colonization. In Canada, a history of land theft and racist public policy that's been directed at Indigenous communities, Black, Asian, and other racialized immigrants. That's included racist immigrant policies, as I mentioned, land theft, as well as the genocide and creation of residential schools, which continued in Canada until 1996, was the last residential school that was closed for Indigenous people in Canada. That's resulted in an entrenched racialization of poverty and criminalization of homelessness, disordered substance use, and other social determinants of health that have been significantly impacting racialized communities in Canada. And in particular, the anti-Indigenous racist systems have been devastating in Canada. And maybe a little bit about, so that's a bit of a backdrop to the British Columbia and Canadian context. And maybe I'll go to speak about Vancouver Foundation specifically and orient you there. Vancouver Foundation was formed in 1943, and its initial endowment was $1.1 million. Despite its name, we actually have a mandate to serve the entire province of British Columbia, even though traditionally our granting has focused mainly around Vancouver, and most of our donors have been from the greater Vancouver area. We currently have $1.5 billion in assets and about 60 staff. And traditionally, our granting has been quite broad for most of its history. And in the last 5 years, we created a significant granting program looking at systems change, which was really moving away from service-focused granting into grants that focus on addressing the root causes of complex issues. And that's been a backdrop for the purpose work that we've been undertaking as well. So that's why I mention it.
Yeah, and you know, our journey to racial equity with racial equity as a concept in the way that we do our work began, as Elizabeth was mentioning, when we reviewed our systems change grantings program. We asked ourselves the question, what are we doing? What do we say we're doing with this granting program? And how are we actually impacting communities on a systemic level? In the short answer, we realized that we were sort of achieving those goals. The win was we were one of the only funders, in Canada to offer grants that addressed root causes and community issues. What didn't work was we were still getting the same usual suspects coming in as grantees. The pool remained largely predominantly white-led organizations, mainstream and large and well-resourced organizations. And so our journey went one level deeper. We realized that we need to, if we were to address something like diversity, inclusion, or JEDI, or whatever words we're choosing to describe racial equity, we need to look at ourselves internally. We are part of the system of philanthropy. And so in order for us to understand racial equity or racial inequities, we need to question ourselves in the greater philanthropic sector as well. What are we contributing to, and what are we not contributing to that goal? This brought us to what we're calling the purpose team and the purpose work. We started as a group of individuals, including Elizabeth and I, where we set off to discuss and debate how Vancouver Foundation can shift and share power to address issues like racial inequity. Among many others, I think in our journey, we realized that racial equity is but one branch on a very large inequitable tree, if you will. And so I'll talk more about what that work looked like in a few slides, but all of this work was also done in partnership with a consulting firm, a design firm called Inward Forward. And through them, they created very innovative and very what I would call fun engagement opportunities to talk about what is and often are very tough topics and concepts. So.
Thanks, Vince. So maybe just a word about moral purpose and what do we mean when we talk about, Vince has mentioned our work in the purpose team to create and develop a moral purpose. So when we think about moral purpose, it's really about the philosophical space that defines how we understand reality. So it's an existential question. How do we see reality, and what is it calling us to do? So it's very foundational and fundamental to the organization. And it answers the questions, what are we here for? And why do we do what we do? So you can imagine that Those were deep and important questions that have taken some time to explore. It's really more than just setting community priorities or goals. And I think that was a big revelation for a number of people, both in the team and who were involved in the purpose work, that this really isn't about saying we care about homelessness or we care about racial equity or we care about, it was, sorry, maybe I'll back up for a second, that it's, that as we set community priorities, it's not about saying, you know, we care about this specific initiative that's happening in this period of time. So I'll stop giving examples, but more fundamental to how we see the world and how we want the world to be shaped. So it underpins our mission and our values and our strategy. And because of that, as I mentioned, it's taken a while for us to work through even understanding philanthropy as a system and then understanding our place in that. And I thought I would provide an example of the Climate Justice Alliance, which is an American foundation. And some of you may be familiar with their work as part of Just Transition. And so they created a moral purpose to build an economic and political power that shifts, and this should say, I noticed it says form, but it should say from an extractive economy to a regenerative one. So that's obviously lies at the very heart of who they are and what they think they should be doing as an organization, but also at an existential level of how they see the world and their capacity to transform it. So I want to talk a bit about some of the trends that we learned about overall in philanthropy. And I will say that I'm just pulling up my notes because I want to make sure I do this right. One of the first things that struck us as we started to look at the systems of philanthropy were that there were many, many ways in which people and cultures expressed philanthropy and expressed generosity and charitable giving. I think we were very used to a Western European tradition that had been exported into North America following colonization. And that's really a system based on the wealthy giving surplus to those less fortunate. That's the philosophical underpinning, I think, arguably. And what we were struck by was just the variety of ways in which different cultures created and expressed philanthropy. So I'll talk a bit about a few of those. And the first of those is Ubuntu, which might be a concept familiar to some folks. This is a tradition that comes out of Southern Africa, the Ngani, Bantu, Zulu, and other people in the region. Ubuntu actually means humanity, but it embodies this concept of I am because we are. And it really creates a community good through unconditional recognition and appreciation for humans and their differences. And I think that's really a very different way of looking at your role in community and why you're in a community, because it establishes a mutual support system to help each other to realize their human potential. That's the foundation of Ubuntu. Some of you may be familiar with the concepts of Tzedakah and Tikkun Olam. Tzedakah is a Hebrew word. It means justice, but it is also the word for charitable giving. And acts and deeds of tzedakah or justice are an integral obligation of Jewish law and culture. And I can say, as a woman who grew up in the Jewish community, it was absolutely central to my own family and the community I grew up in. For many Jews, it's assessed similar to taxes. So you assign a tzedakah amount similar that you would towards your taxes. And the concept of Tikkun Olam is about, it's really about social policy and safeguards for those who are at a disadvantage. And it also refers theologically to the concept of repairing the world and restoring it to God's vision. So that's the centrality of how philanthropy expresses itself in Judaism. I want to talk a little bit about the Anishinaabe Moan people. And some of you may, these are the indigenous people of the central and eastern Canada in the US, including the Ojibwe, the Mississauga, the Algonquin, and other people as well. And the Anishinaabe Moan people have created a concept of the 7 sacred grandfather teachings. And one of the central ones of those is the concept of Zagadiwin, which means love. And it's through that love that Anishinaabe people express their philanthropy. So those gifts are intended to be both reciprocal and unconditional, which I think is, for me, was quite different than the Western tradition I was used to, which is not generally reciprocal and not generally unconditional either. But those traditional teachings are part of what guides community survival and well-being in the Anishinaabe people. And you may be interested to know the other 6 as well, and they are respect, truth, bravery, wisdom, generosity, and humility. Looking at the Gongji, one of the traditions among the Mohist Chinese people is a concept of donations that are made specifically for public good. So, and in the current Chinese state, there is a tax benefit that's provided specifically for projects, institutions, enterprises, and foundations. And it's designed intellectually for a broader public initiative. It's not meant for individuals. And that really stresses the centrality of group over individual in Gongji, which I thought was quite interesting and different than our traditions in Canada. And finally, I wanted to talk about Indigenous gift economies. And these, there are examples of gift economies across the world, but notable ones include Indigenous communities in Canada and the US, and in Aotearoa, or colonially known as New Zealand. So the Maori people of New Zealand and the coastal peoples of Canada and the US, and that's the West Coast where Vince and I live, including the Niska, the Celtic, the Coast Salish, the Tlingit, and many others practice a gift economy traditionally. And again, that giving is designed to be very reciprocal because of the centrality of the act is about creating relationships. So it needs to be reciprocal in order to build those cohesive communities in relationship. It's a system of mutual trust and obligation and solidarity between people. And folks may be familiar with the potlatch ritual, where families traditionally will host other families over a period of time. That can be quite lengthy. It can be a number of weeks, feeding them, offering gifts, etc., as a way to distribute wealth within the community. I'll flip to the next slide. Vince, I'm going to turn it over to you because I know we're running out of time and I'd really like you to have an opportunity to speak.
For sure. I'll jump off with some of those practices, emerging practices that we saw, especially within Canada, from other funding type organizations. We're looking at like the Foundations for Black Community that was established in response to the recognition that a lot of conventional funders are not funding and investing in Black communities across Canada. And so there is and continues to be a distrust from Black communities in Canada that the current system of philanthropy, despite any democratic processes that might be in place for grant making or grant adjudications, will not provide them the fair and even access to resources that they're seeking out. And their lived experiences in Canada tells that to them. And so the organization that is focused on Black communities will not only provide access, but also creates the avenue to attract like-minded funding sources, other actors in the sector to their cause. And Vancouver Foundation is one of them. Where we supported them with some seed funding essentially to start their endowment as well. So the Circle on Aboriginal Philanthropy, I think their name has changed now. It's actually called the Circle for Philanthropy. They are a member-based organization that works with philanthropic institutions to embed Indigenous knowledge and ways of practice to increase justice and equity for Indigenous communities across Canada. They convene space for funding institutions like us to gather and learn and how they can decolonize their grant making, their fundraising, their operations and governance, and act as a bridge between Indigenous communities and organizations and philanthropic institutions like ours, bringing up topics like reparations and land back for further discourse and debate. And these are the spaces that we found ourselves in and having those those deeper conversations, especially in a program that they're currently running called Partners in Reciprocity. And this program has brought in a lot of other funders in and across Canada just to talk about what it means to work with centering Indigenous voices and priorities, what it means to work in a relational way and with values and priorities that we don't set as the conventional funder, for example. Another practice we saw with the Justice Fund in Toronto, I think this is one of the more interesting ones, and ones that definitely is pushing a lot of buttons for folks. They're looking to reform philanthropy as we know it today. The idea is they want to change the disbursement quota from, in Canada, I think it's 3.5 or somewhere around that percentage, to 10%, to lift restrictions on funding what we call non-qualified donees, and to require Canadian foundations to redirect assets to impact investments, SIRs, by 2023. The idea here is to change the way in which we do philanthropy in Canada. One of the more interesting pillars or goals that they have in mind right now is to change the length of time in which community foundations exist. The idea of perpetuity is not something they're interested in supporting. They would like to see a plan to spend down community foundations as you continue to address the causes and issues that are in your community. Definitely recommend giving their website a look through. They have really cool ideas and ones that challenge us in our day-to-day work. And finally, I want to share the Make Way Foundation. In Canada, they have something called the Right Relations Collaboration or Collaboratory. And the program is meant to address power dynamics that they've seen when engaging Indigenous communities and individuals in their work. And so they brought together a group of aunties that will come and support and debate and discuss what it means to center their voices. And so they are there to change the dynamic of grant making. Why do we need this report? Why do we need to fill this form out? Why does the application look this way? Really an opportunity to break down what we hold to be like the typical ways of doing grant making. And to bring in voices and their perspectives and lived experiences that will allow us to shift and actually share power in a different way. And so I think it's such a cool and very tangible way in which a funding institution is trying to change their processes, trying to change how and who they grant to by really bringing folks into decision-making power and the decision-making table rather. And so that's really like one of the most tangible things we've seen when it comes to shifting and sharing power. Thank you. So I spoke a little earlier about the purpose team. And so I'm going to go a little deeper into what Vancouver Foundation has done when it comes to racial equity, to shifting and sharing power. The team of 7 that I spoke about earlier, the purpose team, has now become a team of 30, 25, and there are separate cohorts in which they went through a 6-month process to dive deeper into what it means to shift and share power, what it means to understand philanthropy from a different worldview. Using the collaborative inquiry methodology, we were able to get staff to really essentially be in a learning space together, to critique, to debate, and from it, and why we know Dace are the podcasts that was generated to support this learning, to dive into these topics further. And so that work continues, and that work is kind of becoming a part of how we will move forward with our moral purpose, but more to that in my next slide. We are embedding trust-based philanthropy. Sorry, I didn't mean actually move the slide. I'll talk about it after. Trust-based philanthropy is something that we're curious about and have tested in various capacities. While we're doing all this purpose work, we're also trying to see what it means to have less reporting, what it means to offer multi-year general dollars, what it looks like to do applications that are not, burdensome to the community, for example. And we continue to kind of pull them into our daily practices and to learn from them. A learning report is generated and now going to our committee to highlight what we've learned this year. Some good, some didn't work for us, and that's okay. That's part of learning. But to see it in action is something we wanted to take place this year. And so the next thing that we've done is called the equity matrix. This is a big beast, and so I'm going to try to be very concise with it. It's essentially a way for us to understand the distinctions between organizations that serve equity denied communities versus those that are led by and partnered with equity denied groups and communities. And so the idea here is that the organizations that are self-led, the communities is represented in leadership and board and decision-making. Those are the types of organizations rather that are better at creating more effective solutions for community issues. And so we're using this matrix in one of our granting streams currently to understand how best to direct our funding to organizations across BC. The New Relationship Trust is an organization that's brand new, similar to the Foundations for Black Communities in Canada. They work directly with Indigenous communities to ensure to get them funding for the projects that mean the most to them. And we've worked very closely with them with a funding stream in directing dollars there to support Indigenous communities and land-based communities across Canada. And finally, our Granting Hub project. This is the most tangible and most real project out of, actually they're all very tangible and real, but this one I'm most excited about because I'm very directly connected to it. It is a platform for donors to engage with and further fund potentially BIPOC-led organizations that we currently work with. We're using an internal framework to identify BIPOC organizations, similar to the equity matrix I mentioned, and upload them essentially onto a portal for donors to kind of peruse through to see, like, actually, I love this organization, the work that they're doing. And some of the criteria and frameworks that we're using is, the organization should ideally be small to medium size, for example. So we're not constantly getting and funding big institutions, whether or not they are BIPOC led, whether or not they are Black led, for example, are all the questions that we ask so that we're bringing the right folks to the front of the line for further funding. Finally, and with a few minutes to spare, what's next for us? Well, there's a lot happening still, and it continues to be emergent for us, which is our favorite word of the year. Right now, we're spending time on internal and external learning and consultation. That's just the fancy way of saying we're waiting and seeing, and we're doing and learning at the same time. We want to know and continue to hear from community, especially with all the purpose work we just described. A lot of that has been what I interpret to be cleaning house before we let the guests in. And now that we have the house in a presentable manner, it's time to let folks in and have their say on what we've been doing and where they see this moving forward. And then the biggest question for us, and a North Star that we hope to answer at some time soon, articulate a moral purpose for the whole organization. As it stands now, and the way I often look at it is our current purpose, our current value statements, states that we are here to create livable, vibrant, and welcoming communities rather. And so to me, that's not enough. We need more, right? We need something that can help us say yes or no to things. And so that's where that work is going. Awesome, and I think I'm handing it off to Dace. So
I'm coming back. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Great presentation. We're going to turn it over now to some of my colleagues at the Denver Foundation. First, we'll start with Charmaine Brown, who's the Senior Scholarships Officer. And then following her, we'll move to Genevieve Laca, who's the Director of Engaged Philanthropy. Charmaine.
Thanks, Dace, and thank you, Elizabeth and Vince, for sharing such wonderful insights with us today. I want to take a few moments to just share what the Denver Foundation has been up to. Some who are more familiar recognize that we've kind of been in this space of racial equity and DEI work for more than 20 years now. And there's been various iterations of what that work looks like internally and externally. Next slide, please. And often, as we've continued to dive into this work in the conversation, the number one question that comes up is, why racial equity? Why not focus on other aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion work? It's all important. And those are really great questions and reflection points. We've chosen to embed racial equity as our focal point because we understand how race has been used as a main determinant in creating these inequitable systems. And thus, it continues to perpetuate harm and injustices and create barriers that are exclusive for members of our society, particularly those who identify as people of color. And so we are recognizing that by centering racial equity as the through line of our work, it further allows us to support the systems change work that we are in service of, which is a collective benefit for everyone in our community. Next slide, please. So whether you're longtime friends of ours or new to the foundation in terms of partnering with us, you may have seen and heard us reference to our vision, mission, and purpose over the course of time. And we're really grounded in mitigating those racial disparities while inspiring people to activate and mobilize the resources in pursuit of a Metro Denver that is racially equitable in its leadership, in its prosperity, and its culture. Next slide. And as I mentioned a moment ago, the foundation has been moving along this spectrum for quite some time. And so to try to capture all of it here within a few moments just doesn't speak to the real breadth and depth of everything that we've been continuing to involve ourselves in. But just a quick snapshot allows us to first start with the Inclusiveness Project, which really helped to provide guidance to nonprofit organizations and funders on how to be more inclusive, particularly with engaging people of color within the nonprofit sector. And with our work in elevating philanthropy in communities of color, we've had the opportunity to really engage and work alongside our BIPOC giving circles, recognizing and supporting philanthropists of color in their collective giving with their goal of creating positive community change. And in June of 2020, there was the launch of the Black Resilience in Colorado Fund, or the BRIC Fund, which we're really excited about. And under the current leadership of Director LaDawn Sullivan, the BRIC Fund specifically works to support Black nonprofit organizations that are both serving in those community and just helping to really uplift the work that's happening. The other work that takes place within the BRIC Fund is the Executive Directors of Color Institute, which is a 2-year leadership development and organizational capacity building program for BIPOC nonprofit leaders. And most recently, we just celebrated the 25th anniversary of the Strengthening Neighborhoods program, which makes grants directly to projects and campaigns led by residents from BIPOC communities and communities with lower incomes. And so all of this work collectively has really helped to be a catalyst and set the tone for all the various ways that the foundation continues to think about how we create space. How do we more intentionally lean into practices to really build up a more inclusive and equitable Denver? Next slide, please. And continuing on all of that work, within the last couple of years, we've also had more intentional focuses working alongside our investment consultant, NEPC, to really evaluate some of the strategies of our investment management to better align in a more inclusive and racially equitable way, and really diversifying our assets in that space. We've been working really hard to expand our vendor partnerships and prioritizing relationships with small businesses, BIPOC-owned and women-owned companies. And we've been looking at refining our hiring practices, which have allowed us to really assess the types of qualifications we're asking for and helping to eliminate barriers that might be exclusive to that process in order to build up a more robust and inclusive applicant pool. Our phenomenal communications team has really done a great job with our marketing and strengthening up our storytelling to be more representative of the individuals engaging in philanthropy, and really thinking about the use of language and what that means as we continue to share and uplift the stories within our communities. We continue to strive to diversify our board and our committees to be more reflective of our communities as well, and really thinking about what it looks to have partnership that's collaborative across all areas and aspects of the work that we're doing. Internally, we've really worked on building up our cultural framework that is really there to help set and dig deeper into how we think about and incorporate racial equity within our work as a belief, as a part of our structure and systems, practices, and as a critical competency. And this cultural framework really helps to support the development of skills necessary to engage in the work thoughtfully to help drive accountability through our behaviors. Our staff has also worked with consultants over the course of time to support our continued learning to help deepen our considerations of impact, think more about the tangible ways to apply the practices of racial equity in our day-to-day work and our roles. And previously, we did hold race-based self-identified self-caucuses that allowed time and space for our staff members to come together to discuss issues and learnings relevant to each of the caucuses around the topic of racial equity. And more recently, we've had the opportunity to hold book clubs and staff gatherings to discuss the themes of race and the intersection of other identities, to think about how this impacts our work, both in our priority areas and in philanthropy as a whole. And we continue to evaluate through our community grants program, the ways in which we can apply a racial equity lens through our grant making processes and prioritize funding to support BIPOC-led organizations to help combat the racial and ethnic disparities that still exist in our community. And so all of that to say, we talk about the journey that individuals and organizations are on as they expand their engagement in the active practice of racial equity. And we recognize that there is an opportunity and an obligation to step into the space to keep uncovering the ways that we can all support our communities and nonprofits to do the work that is needed to really help everyone who calls Metro Denver home prosper in the best of ways. And now at this time, I'd like to invite my colleague, Genevieve Laca, who's the director of our Engaged Philanthropy, to share more about our grant making and how you can think about racial equity in your own grant making practices.
Thank you, Charmaine. I think that teed up my conversation so well so that you can understand all of the background work that we did previous to our own work directed to our grant making that we hope to share with you. Much like the Vancouver Foundation, it hasn't been a straight arrow. We've made some stumbles, we've made some successes, we've talked to some of our partners, we've talked to other funders and donors like you to learn before we entered this work, and we continue to learn. This work is particularly of interest to me and a big focal point of why I joined the Denver Foundation because of my background. My dad's side is Native Aztec and my mom's side is Black, Cherokee, German, French, and British. And so if you're thinking that sounds like the best dinner ever, it is. I assure you, it is delicious. And it led to a lot of talks about race and inequity at my table, at my family's table, ever since I was little. And so these things have always been in the back of my head. And I've been a direct party to and a direct contributor to institutional philanthropy. And one way I would like to maybe challenge philanthropy a bit is to think about institutional versus traditional. Often with foundations, we think of the word traditional philanthropy versus maybe these new avant-garde models. But I think of traditional philanthropy in a more burgeoning view of it is that traditional philanthropy actually dates back thousands of years. You can probably think about it in your family and particularly in communities of color. Some of the ones that were mentioned, traditions and cultural values that were mentioned earlier by Vancouver Foundation, as well as in your own families. So for us, burying loved ones together is a huge part of my family's culture, and really taking part in those day-to-day, getting sneakers for the kid down the street is just as much an important part. And I believe both institutional philanthropy and traditional have a great access point for everyone. And so as we think about these next steps, I'm going to walk you through the community-centric model, which is very similar to the trust-based model. I'll then walk through a bit of bias and then some tools that you can maybe enact even this fall for your next grant cycle through your donor advised fund. But just know, as you're thinking about all of this, you may already be partially on your way along this journey, and we're here to help. So after this discussion, please think about contacting us to talk about some next steps for research or just thought making with your family to continue this journey. So within the community-centric giving model, next slide, please. What is it? It's really centering the community's voice and understanding that they probably know their needs and what's going to be culturally competent better than anyone else, and really giving them the resources and trust to run with it. So sometimes it is investing in a concept that is fairly new, maybe in an organization that's a little more grassroots and small, but knows everyone in that neighborhood. They know exactly what the issues are that are being faced and what the tangential issues are as well. So what else is affecting education, education outcomes in that community? And so this is really affecting the long-term quality of life as opposed to a consistent year-over-year stopgap. So what do we talk about under community-centric models? This is really all the components when put together make for really beautiful grant making. So when you think about community voice, it means meeting with people that you might not be normally meeting with, or sitting and just absorbing for a while and hearing from them what the needs are, and then pausing, and instead of inserting "this sounds like a great solution," seeing if they have some ideas for solution next. Flexibility. These needs are very complex, and so there might be some stumblings. And I'm sure everyone on this call has had some stumblings and things that you've tried in your work in the past, and the same thing for changing very complex community needs. So what that looks like in grant making could be, if you're doing a 3-year grant, maybe for a program, having that trust built with the nonprofit for them to come to you and say, you know, I don't know that program is the top need for us right now. Could we maybe change our funding through you to this other program, or really lift up some different voices? And having that trust there to say, yep, let's make some changes, instead of waiting, you know, a year, 5 years, 10 years, like some foundations do, to really make those tweaks over time. For funding, it's often what was beautifully mentioned by Vancouver Foundation: less strings, more funding, and multi-year funding are all key pieces. And that trust, so letting them kind of run with their ideas, working at that hyper local level, is also crucial, because what might work in Northwest Denver is certainly not going to work in Parker, is certainly not going to work in Douglas County. So as we think about the variety in Denver, Metro Denver, and in Colorado, just knowing that there's not one solution for every problem. And thinking outside the box. Some of these groups come up with incredible ideas, and myself and my team have the honor of sitting on these calls or going out to these nonprofits and hearing about solutions that we would have never thought of here at the foundation. And I'm proud to say that the Denver Foundation is often the risk taker for an early grant to those outside the box ideas that then become some of the lead institutions 10 years down the road, when that concept is more normalized. So implicit and unconscious bias. I'm sure you've all had a training on this at work, or you've talked about it with your family, but it really does play a very important part in grant making, and all of us have bias. You'll not be surprised to hear that I've thought about bias with my family as we do our grant making, and each of us have come from maybe different education backgrounds or different pieces of us that make us gravitate towards or away from certain groups. So they are social stereotypes. They're based on a variety of factors, meaning that your bias is as complex as you are, and there's no one who has the exact same bias as you do. So that's why it's really important for each of us to think about our individual bias prior to grant making, so that we know which pieces are going to help us and which pieces are going to set us back on this racial equity journey. It's also important to know that bias is not in and of itself a bad thing. It is when it inhibits you from taking a risk or working with a group that you normally wouldn't work with, that it does kind of hold you back. There are the types of implicit bias on the right-hand column, and you can see this is ever growing as well. So, you know, I think even in 2, 3, 5 years, this list will look even different than it is today. So you're thinking, I've thought about bias a little bit, I'll do some more work, but what does it mean for my upcoming grant cycle with my donor advised fund? Sometimes it is, I'm not as familiar or comfortable with this group, and so I will ask for more reporting requirements. There have been 3 studies done in the last 2 years on reporting, and all 3 have shown significantly more reporting requirements year over year for BIPOC-led, specifically Black-led organizations within these 3 studies on compared to white organizations that have a deeper level of institutional trust with their grantors and donors. Less risk taking. So saying, you know, we're not going to give you general operating funds. We're going to give something very specific. And that goes against that community centric model I was talking about of flexibility of funding. Then you talk about the disproportionate foundation grant making. So when you think about all the grant making put together, only 8.5% goes to BIPOC communities. And as you think about different bias, is it you really like their structure? It fits well with the model that you're used to. Is it affiliation bias? I recognize that someone who is an ED at another organization graduated from the same college I did, so I had that instant affinity. And that is not a bad thing. That's how we as humans make connections, but shouldn't necessarily overly influence my decision to grant to them over another organization just because they have a similar background to me. So these are some of the things that it's very helpful, and you'll get resources on these to dig deeper following the presentation. So let's talk about some tools to put equity into practice. I think sometimes this can become such a philosophical idea that it's hard to really think, well, how can I start now? This sounds really overwhelming. This sounds like something where I could stumble. It is okay to stumble. I think it is most important to try to start that work. And over time, you can look back and see your equity journey in play through the different grants that you do and the deeper relationships you form with nonprofits in the community. So centering that constituent and BIPOC voice, this might be letting us know, Denver Foundation, these are the areas that I really like, but these are the institutions, large institutions I've always given to. Just as a micro example, Latina Safe House serves domestic violence survivors in a way that is culturally competent for the Latino community. So thinking through, if that is an area that you've always thought about, that there might be some other groups that are smaller, not going to have the big billboards, but are going to have a deep impact on the communities they serve. Multi-year grants. So could we think about using your DAF to have a long-term relationship where they're not worried about the funding year over year and can relax a little bit, be a little bit more honest about what's going on with them. And you can learn as well about some of the complex issues. For those of you who do have some applications, we'd love to work through them with you and see if we can shorten them even a little more. And thinking of the types of impact. So often when we think of grant making, we think of those direct service, getting meals out the door, getting people directly housed, but housing isn't going to be completely solved without advocacy and community organizing to make sure that the inequities far upstream are actually addressed. So these are the different types of impact that you could potentially have in your community. And with that, I would just end to say, there are some great values at play in terms of the inclusive practices, and these are much more centered on your internal focus. So the first ones were about the practices of grant making. And this one is, how are you going to set your goals? Maybe you have a goal in addition to the 3 that you always fund, to fund 2 new organizations at a smaller level. Less risk, but start developing those relationships and considering the power dynamics. So instead of, or in addition to a site visit with a nonprofit, maybe you can get to know them through a volunteer day that they have and more passively see the work that they do, where they're not going to be as guarded and you're going to have more of a genuine sense of what's going on at the organization. And inclusive practices, I'm speaking to checking your bias, thinking about those inclusive practices of being cognizant of looking back maybe at your last 5 years of grant making and saying, how many were white-led and white majority staffed? How many do serve maybe 40% or less of the BIPOC community through their work? And we can help you through those steps to see where your grant making has actually done the most good in community and see if you want to shift that focus a bit. Lastly, I would say we do have a host of organizations who have been doing this for quite some time, funds here at the Denver Foundation, and they have lists of nonprofits that we have vetted, we have worked with very closely, and we have a very strong trust-based philanthropy relationship with them. So if you're curious about any of these groups' previous grant making, or you want to learn more about them, or even speak with them and learn from them, I know that these groups would be more than happy to share what they have done. And we as relationship managers here at the Denver Foundation would be happy to support you as well. So hopefully that gives you some initial ideas on how to shift your philanthropy a little bit, or think about it through a racial equity lens. And with that, I will close and hand it back over to Dace for our Q&A.
Great. Thanks, Charmaine. Thanks, Genevieve. Great information. We would love to have all of our panelists turn their cameras back on and join me for, we're going to do just a couple minutes of Q&A. If we don't get to your question, because we're a little bit shorter on our Q&A time, we'll send out in our follow-up materials answers to any questions that we didn't have the opportunity to get to. So let me start with a question to the Vancouver Foundation. How has your board of directors been involved in your work related to racial equity and the decolonizing efforts that you mentioned? How do you ensure that everyone shares the priorities, even when the specifics of the work may look a little different across the staff and board? Great question.
Thanks, Dace. I'll field that one. And thanks, Sean, for the question. It's a great question. And so Vince had mentioned the cohorts that we put together for the purpose work. And we had one of those cohorts was our senior executive and board. I think one of the, well, we talked a bit about stumbling and learning. One of the things that we learned through that is that all our board is volunteer, and the amount of time that we were asking for in terms of the cohort was probably disproportionate to the amount of time that they could give. So we did have board members who participated in the cohort, and that was a central way that we wanted to involve them in that moral purpose work. And we found that many of our board members did not have the time to participate. And while staff, we could carve out that time, that was more difficult on the volunteer side. So Vince also mentioned that we have 9 podcasts and 7 sort of shorter concept books that were developed as assets for that. And right now we're in the process of thinking about how to repurpose those assets so that we can get information to the board, have that dialogue, involve them, but more in ways that I think are going to ultimately be palatable from a time perspective, because, you know, I think it's always a tension to get, you know, to involve people and do that in a way that is respectful of their time. So I think we're trying to balance those two things right now. What I do know going forward is that having all of our board members involved is going to be pretty central to, you know, what we don't want to do is pitch up with a lot of work from the staff that is completely unknown by the board and completely uninvolved. That's so it's a bit of a work in progress, I guess, is the answer.
Thank you. It's a tricky one to figure out, but one that's really rewarding, I think, when you can get in that same swim lane together with your board and your staff. Charmaine, I want to ask you just to speak a little bit about our book club. Could you talk about some of the things that we read, maybe just a little bit about just, you know, kind of what those dialogues did as a staff?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I believe we dropped in the chat, if you didn't have a chance to see the list of books that we read. The first one was Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, and then followed by Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi. And then the last one we just wrapped up a few months ago was There by Tommy Orange. And all of those heavy readings, obviously, but they were good. I think they were very insightful for us to think about not only the context of the information that was being presented in the books, but how do you specifically intersect that with philanthropy and the questions that continue to come up in terms of how we do our work. I think Vince and Elizabeth kind of alluded to, you know, we're participating in a system that in and of itself creates inequitable practices. So how do we more intentionally engage differently? And so it also gave us an opportunity, kind of coming off of the last answer, to engage with our board as well. So to kind of hear that dialogue, to hear what the other side was considering as part of those conversations, I think has been really helpful, fruitful for us to just continue either holding the dialogue or thinking about the ways we can put action into that.
Charmaine. Vince, question for you. You gave this kind of beautiful analogy in your talk about kind of getting the house in order before you invited people in. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of the nitty gritty of that. How long did you go about cleaning a house before it was open to the community? And then how were they received when they came in?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I love that the analogy sticks. 2 years plus, it's still happening as we continue to understand exactly what we want to show, how we want to show it. And I would say like we're almost ready to open the door. We're now kind of in the step of like the second set of the purpose team is moving forward, and they will determine how to best approach this, and especially with the engagement of community. We actually have a new department just started literally last month. It's Department of Engagement, and they will be supporting a lot of this, opening the doors, opening the windows, doing the warm welcome to everyone. But I will say this, it takes as long as your most hesitant and most resistant team member. And I don't say this in a negative light. I say this as like, this is a journey, and our job, our role is to ensure folks have what it takes, have what they need from tools, workshops, what have you, to come along on that journey, to be part of this, let's go clean the basement, let's go clean the attic, like that will take time. And I think that's something that we in our team often reminded ourselves. It's like, just because we can think, ahead this many years doesn't mean everyone else can. And we're doing ourselves a disservice if we don't bring everyone, especially critical players, along in that journey.
So true, so true. Well, here we are, close to the end of our time, and I'm going to ask you in a second to fill out a survey. So I want to just give us a minute of time before the hour so that you have a chance to do that. But first, I really want to thank all of our panelists for all of your insight and experience and expertise. Really appreciate you sharing with us today. And then I'd love to thank all of you who joined us as guests today. It's such an important dialogue for us to be in together, and really look forward to continuing to engage in this work together with you. As always, you'll receive an email in follow-up to this session with a sheet of ways to engage. They'll have some readings and some opportunities and some organizations, lots of good stuff. So lots of tips and tricks, and we're really happy to share those with you and to share more if you continue to be interested. And then here it is, me asking you, please fill out our survey. We're really trying to make sure that the Denver Foundation works as a learning organization. And to do that, we really need to make sure that we have your feedback about those times that we're engaging together. So you'll see it in the chat. It's just 5 questions. So don't be scared. You don't have to be on forever. But would love to hear from you. And as I said at the beginning, this is our last Leading and Learning for the year. Our announcement of our 2023 topics will be coming out soon, so be on the lookout for that. Until next time, thanks so much.